Okay, in terms of the stuff, deadlines are changified, so they remain exam 2, covering part 2, and quizzes part 3, covering part 3. Deadline is Friday, so tomorrow at the end of the day, 11 to 9 p.m. Just be sure to complete them before that. For exam 3, covering part 3, exam 4, covering part 4, and quizzes part 4, they deadline April 26th, which is last day of classes, although our last class will be the 25th because we don't meet on Fridays. And the deadline for those is 11 to 9 p.m. You can do them ahead of time, of course, but just be sure to complete them before the deadline. Exam 5 deadlines at the end of the normal final time during finals week, and to see if you need that, because again, the best 4 exams count, the best 10 quizzes, and so to see if you need the exam 5, you go and put in your paper grade, put in your overall quiz grade, put in your best 3 exams, put in a hypothetical 100 for the final, and that's better than your overall grade by at least the letter grade or more, and taking the final could be worth it. And again, you can put in whatever numbers you want to see like what you'd have to get. Obviously, if you get an A without the final, you're done, unless you just like taking finals. And if you have less than an A, you can see if the final would do something. And if you haven't done something, it's automatically treated as a 0, not because I like failing people, but that way you can see your real grade in real time. So there won't be any like sudden shock at the end where all the zeros go in, you're like, oh my God, what's happening? And so right now, everything you haven't done, like you haven't done exam 5 or quiz 3, exams 3 and 4, 0's there. And as you do stuff, of course, your grade will change. So the long and the short of it is your grade will never go down. It'll either stay the same or go up. If you do see it drop, like your overall grade drop, let me know because something bad is occurring. For the paper, draft deadline today, I'll be in my office 2 to 4 for my normal office hours, and I'll do the drafts as they come in. And then if people don't come out and pick them up, I'll put them in the pickup envelope, which is outside by the outer door to the office. So it's like a drop envelope and then a pickup one. Plus our deadline will be April 9th. So at the end of day, you don't have to do a hard copy for that. Just go to Blackboard, upload it. Be sure to upload it to the actual +5 one, because the ungraded safe assignment thing is for checking your paper, for plagiarism. I don't actually, grade that part of it. Then if you don't happen to have the paper done then, or if you want more time, April 16th is full credit, the emergency deadline for no questions asked, you just get another week, just, cause. And then there's the desperation deadline on the 26th, when people who realize they did enroll in this class and they just find out, oh crap, I mean, that does happen, it does happen. But sometimes people still pass, amazingly. They do everything like at the end. It is quite a show. Okay, so that's the stuff to be. Before going on to the stuff, anything about that stuff or other stuff that needs more stuff before going on to this stuff? Okay, so last time we were looking at our good, some dead, some living externalists and externals. And to kind of illustrate the difference with a metaphor, you kind of think of it kind of like this way. Imagine you've got a robot drone, like you're an intrepid explorer exploring wrecks at the bottom of the ocean. And you send down your aqua drone, call it Shark to Claw. It's got a grabby claw in it, a cool shark thing. So you send Shark to Claw down at the bottom to take pictures and stuff, and it comes back up to the surface, and it's got like on the, its memory card, a picture of a megalodon, like one of those huge giant sharks. Also the subject of a movie by the same name, about a giant shark. You're like, holy crap, got a picture of a supposedly extinct creature. Or even cooler, maybe like some sort of aquatic dinosaur. Now, if you were an externalist with a metaphor, what you would do is, you wouldn't ask the drone, obviously, are you justified in your belief and asking it for a warranty and so forth. You would look at the mechanisms. You check to make sure, okay, were the cameras working properly, or was the distortion makes it look like this creature. Was the image already there on the film card? Maybe someone was playing a practical, pranking you, or playing a joke, or up to some sort of scam. And you'd examine the drone to see if everything was working properly. And if everything was working fine, all the mechanisms were working fine, and everything was okay, you would say, well, that's correct. Now, metaphorically, the externalist kind of does a similar thing. So if you have the belief in your brain, the right way, you wouldn't, you don't ask the person like questions about do they know and how do they know. It's just this reliable process. Again, when you examine the drone, you obviously wouldn't like inquire about its, its justifications and so forth in terms of like its what it knows. You would just look at how it did it, because you'd examine it. If it's got the picture on the memory card in the right way, you'd say legit picture. And so in this case, you would just look at the mechanism. You wouldn't even in a way have to talk to the person. You could see their belief, and if it's caused in the right way, you'd say check. They know. Now the internalists, their view is, of course, you do have to go and see if the person knows that they know, and they've got the right kind of justification. It's kind of like, to use a metaphor, it's kind of like, it's like giving an alibi in a way. The person is trying to like say why they're, or they did something wrong, and they're asking like, why did you kill that person or do that? And they have to tell their story about justification. So it's up to them to do that kind of justification. And so for the externalist, again, it's sort of like, are all the mechanisms in place? Did that all work correctly? And if it ends up there in the right way, then knowledge. And in the case of the internalist, it's about, as the name says, it's all about what the person knows, what they know they know. Now, one illustration of this, kind of boring one, is the dining room one. So again, imagine someone saw a dining room, and then they're asked what it's like, and they, long ago, like from about 8 years ago, and they say like, what did it look like? And they're able to answer all these questions, but they really can't say how they're doing it. And what actually happened was, their perceptual mechanisms of their eyes picked it up, stored it, and then they retrieved it. Are they justified? What if they're guessing? What if they really didn't believe it? Now, the externalists would say, as long as, again, going back to my picture metaphor, as long as the picture got in there the right way, knowledge. Then using the human example, as long as the information about the dining room got in there the right way, then knowledge, or something like that. So externalists would say, yeah, the person knows, even if they can't say, how they did it, even if they're just guessing, even if they don't really believe it. Now the internalists would say, borderline justification at best, or perhaps even unjustified. So kind of the battle is, again, going back to the metaphor, is it just a matter of, from the standpoint of like a third party, would they look at the mechanism and say, all the mechanisms are working properly, so check? Or is it up to the person who claims to know to actually have the justifying story? And again, the good metaphor is, for the externalist in a way, would be kind of like the Shakta cloth, that as long as we got that thing in our brain the right way, through these reliable mechanisms, using the Shakta metaphor, the camera's working, the process is working, the memory card wasn't tampered with, so it all worked in the same way, we'd say legitimate image. And likewise with us, like as long as everything's working right and we get the thing in there, then that's all that matters. Whether we can justify it or not. We just say, we have to say anything, just say, yeah, I'm saying this stuff. Now for the internalist, again, it's like the story of justification. It's like you have to give an account and say why it was okay, why it was, you're believing it, it's right that you believe it. And that's kind of the battle. Do you have to do the justification yourself, or is it just a matter of was stuff working properly? And as you might imagine, the people who believe on the other sides fight about this. Now, one of the main criticisms of this is something you might already suspect, namely, what counts as a reliable belief-forming mechanism? It's pretty vague. So what would be to use like a legitimate, concrete question, how reliable does it have to be? If you're able to somehow test it, would it have to be 90%, 60%, 75%? What would it have to be? Now, to be fair to the externalists, they could work this out, but it is a problem until they give us a good account of how this mechanism works and what percentage of beliefs that it gets right, counts reliable, then we can always say that's pretty vague. But going back to the structure claw metaphor, we could do a similar thing. We're talking about ever building a robot or a drone to do with sensors on it. We'd want to have set a pretty good standard about how accurate it has to be the data that it gets. I guess we could do the same thing with people. Next, normativity. As I mentioned in my metaphor, one way to look at epistemology in the past was very similar to ethics, and that's what our good friend Chisholm did, talking about preferable beliefs. And so going back to Plato, the idea was it wasn't just getting it right, believing it and getting it right, and it wasn't just a matter of getting the beliefs in the right way. You had to be able to give reasons. And literally, justification means that you are literally justified. You're giving an account of why it's okay for you to believe that. So part of the justification would include you get the belief in the right way. But critics of externalism say that it's necessary, that you can't be justified unless you get it in the right way, but just getting it in the right way is not sufficient, so they claim. And so what they try to crank out are counterexamples, where you get the belief in the right way, but intuitively we would say they don't know. And of course one problem is that people disagree about their intuition. It's like the same thing as with ethics. If you say intuitively blah blah blah, some people say, yeah, totally get that. Other people say, I don't get that at all. Because people have very different intuitions. So what's one of the most famous counterexamples? Well, again, it's philosophy, so its fame is pretty limited. It's from a fellow named Laurence Bonjour. But he must have a weird time in France. If he was saying, bonjour, bonjour. It's like, are you talking to me or just saying hello? That's why you never want your last name to be like a greeting, because then it gets confusing. As if you live in a place where it is the greeting. So Lawrence comes with this counterexample. Imagine we have a person, Samantha, and without any reason or justification, she thinks she's clairvoyant. She thinks she can see places and know things far from her. And she believes that President Trump, it actually works out pretty conveniently, is in New York City. Now, she believes this despite all the evidence that seems to show he's in Washington, D.C. The press says he's in D.C., there's a broadcast claiming to be from the White House, etc. But, as a matter of fact, the president really is in New York City. And the evidence is all a smokescreen created because there's an assassination threat. Someone is starting to kill the president. And they're setting it up as like a sting operation. So instead of the president being in the Oval Office, it'll be Alec Baldwin and the Secret Service waiting for him. Which Baldwin plays Trump? Is it Alec? There's so many of them, it's hard to keep track of them. The Baldwin guy plays Trump, whoever that guy is. That one of the Baldwins. Now, Samantha, imagine that she does, in fact, have clairvoyant powers. Now, and that her belief actually did come from that. Now, this would seem to meet all the requirements of externalism, because she has no idea, she thinks she's a clairvoyant, but she has no reason to think so. There's no evidence at all for it. Like she, doesn't reliably win the lottery, consistently, etc. So she just thinks she has psychic powers, but no reason to do so. And she suddenly develops the belief the president of New York City. And turns out she's right. And she's right because her real clairvoyant power is kicked in, giving her that belief. But she has no idea, she really is clairvoyant because she has no evidence for it. And she just happens to believe this, and it just happens to be because of this power. Now, the externalists would have to say, yeah, then she knows the president of New York City. Now, Bonjour says, we wouldn't leap to saying she's actually justified. So if we knew that she thought she was clairvoyant, but she had no reason for it, and she just happened to have power, worked in this case, and gave her this information, we'd be inclined to say she doesn't really know. Now the obvious problem here is this is a matter of intuition, because if you're leaning towards externalism, you'd say, yeah, I mean, it's kind of a weird case, but yes, she would know. And then the critic would say, well, no, that's just too weird. And then someone might also say, yeah, the psychic power thing is really screwing this up because there's none of that stuff, so it makes the whole example kind of needlessly weird. And so it does come down to a battle of intuitions. So the critics of externalism would say, even if our good dead friend Bishop Ussher, the guy who said the Earth was created in 4004 BC, and even if the present-day creationists who hold that belief, got their beliefs in a reliable way from God, and they didn't have good information, good reasons to believe that this is actually occurring, according to the critics would say, as long as they themselves weren't able to justify it, to give good reasons for their beliefs, they would say they're not justified in their beliefs. Of course, the externalists would say that they were. And again, the battle comes down to your intuitions. Do you have to do the explaining, or can it just be a matter of you happen to just get it right? I mean, another metaphor might be like with an ID card, where a person, their ID card is questioned, they give an account of why it's a genuine ID card, whereas in another case, a person's, they've got they have like a fake ID card, but it actually, by pure chance, turned out to be like replaced by a real one. They happen to just get accidentally, but it's real, so their ID is okay. And so even if they have no reason to think it's okay, it's still okay. And you can kind of go either way with intuitions. In one case, you might say that if someone just has the idea that they have no reason to think it's real, but it happens to be real by pure chance because they just got it by accident, you would say, well, I guess they do have an ID, but then you would say, well, they're not really justified in having that ID. Whereas if someone has one and they have good reasons for having it, you would say they're justified in that ID. And then people battle some more. Another point of concern is the counterfactual. Namely, the reliabilists seem to always have to give counterfactual accounts of knowing. So they get all the problems from those accounts, because they need to specify the belief forming mechanisms in specific cases to make all this stuff work. So what are some of the famous philosophers, other ones who talked about this? Well, this is just sort of a quick sketch, so that way if someone ever mentions them, you can say, yeah, I've heard of that guy. First, Alvin Goldman. What did he do? Well, he develops a causal account of foundational justification, and he calls it historical reliabilism. And it gets weirdly complicated because he takes the time slice theories and contrasts his own theory with the time slice theory. So what are the time slice theories? Well, their approach is this. What justifies a belief is a function of what is true for that believer at that time. So even though it sounds kind of complicated, like time slice or synchronic, it just means, you're justified because it's justified, the function of what is true for the believer at the time of believing. His version is this historical reliabilism, namely that justification of a belief is a function of the belief's prior history, sort of its resume, specifically whether it's produced the right way or not. So essentially its historical pedigree. And so his theory is both objectivist, he believes that it's not subjective, and also external. Now to use a metaphor to explain Goldman's view, you can use the following bad metaphor. Now if we think of a belief as like an antique, Now, so the problem with a belief is, the question is, is that belief, knowledge? And the externalist, for the externalist, it's, the question of, did it get there the right way? Now we can go to a metaphor of the antique. In the case of an antique, the key question is it genuine or not? So something is supposed to be a, 16th century, painting or 5th century, statue. The question is it really that? Now, the epistemic problem with an antique is getting its provenance, basically establishing that it is what it is purported to be. And of course, the way you do that is you would have a link, historical link, from now back to whenever it supposedly came from. So if it's supposed to be a 5th century statue, you would have ideally an unbroken chain connecting it back to that. And so what Goldman is doing is a similar sort of thing. If you have a belief, you look at the provenance of the belief, tracing it back. And if it has the right provenance, the right history, you would then, according to Goldman, you would say it's justified because of its history. It came about this right way. Just like if you were an antique dealer, an honest one, you would say this is a legitimate antique because you have the causal link back to the past. It is the right history. So one metaphor that would motivate that would be the antique one. Another fellow, Keith Lehrer, he does kind of a survey work mapping out the geography of the debate, and he contends that Goldman is wrong and argues in favor of internalism. I think he's dead now too. Alvin Plantinga, another famous philosopher you've probably never heard of. I think he has a Wikipedia page. Maybe all do. Some people went in and put some stuff in. He goes for old school internalism. Back to our good dead friends Descartes and Locke. Because for Descartes, the justification is not like the process of belief being formed. It's, well, we saw Descartes' system. Same for Locke. And so this again kind of ties it back to ethics. You have justification connected with epistemic duties, and it all relates to knowledge. And Plantinga says that notion is super bad. It's utterly incoherent. So what he embraces instead is externalism. Namely, you get rid of that Cartesian and Lockean approach, which he claims is incoherent, and replace it with properly functioning belief-forming mechanisms. So, going back to our Usher example, if Usher was right, and they get their beliefs with a rival mechanism, God giving them their beliefs through divine grace, then Plantinga's theory would be, well, they do have knowledge, because they got it, it's true, they got it through a reliable mechanism. So, what matters is it true? Were they formed in the right way? Even if you can't give any reasons, it would still be knowledge. Now, one concern, of course, about not being able to give any reasons, it's what would you do from a practical standpoint trying to debate with somebody? For example, let's take the anti-vaccination movement. Science says they're wrong. But suppose hypothetically they're actually right. And suppose you have someone who believes it, and the reason why they know it was because they channeled a spirit of knowledge that provided them with that belief. So a supernatural system of belief, but it actually works. And so in externalism, we would say they know. But of course they can't give any justification because they believe it, but they have no reason for it. It just appears in their head, they're already confident in it, but they have no knowledge of the spirit, etc. Now of course the problem would be, if you're trying to debate with them, they would be totally right, and you'd be totally wrong, but there's no reasons for you, no reason for you, reasons you can engage with. They just believe it. And so a problem becomes, the standpoint of practicality, how would you tell, whether someone's belief is a good one or not, unless you had some sort of weird access to this? Now, then the externalists would say, well, that's true, you really couldn't argue with them, but their belief is still knowledge, because they got it in the right way, even though we may never know they got it in the right way. And so it could forever leave the question of who knows stuff unanswered. Maybe it's true that all the people who believe true stuff, they're getting it through supernatural sources, we can't ever prove this, but they're all right and they know stuff, and all the science people are just wrong, and all the debate is pointless. But it seems like quite a leap. Last person, Matthias Stamp. Their approach is to give an account of internalism against Plantinga and deontological and evidentialist. Bringing back in the morality stuff. Deontology is essentially a moral theory that's rule-based. And so he argues against Plantinga that we do have these epistemic duties and that believing does have a matter of choice. And of course Plantinga says that's wrong. And then eventually all these people die. So that's where the debate is now. Our last two famous philosophers, these guys are actually famous philosophers. There's Hilary Kornbluth and David Lewis. Kornbluth, once again, goes through the debate. One thing, if you ever go into grad school or professional academics, whenever you write a paper, what you have to do, a big chunk of the paper is you spend a big chunk of it summing up the current literature, which in a way is good because you always know what to put into your paper, and the first part is in a way kind of easy. You're saying this is what all the other people believe. And then you usually have a small part where you do something original. Dissertations are often the same way. If anybody's considering grad school, kind of the way you do research or dissertation is you spend chapter after chapter laying out what all the other people have said before you, and then you say maybe why they're wrong, then you add in your own bit as some new thing. Or you may say why they're, some new reason why they're right. But a big chunk of it is you guys spend a lot of time just saying what other people said. And some people are critical of that, saying we're kind of going back to the old, thing that led to the Renaissance, which is we're just regurgitating what the people said and then just tacking on some tiny little bit at the end. It's like buying a cake in Publix and you put a candle in it. That's your contribution. And that's kind of how it works. Okay. So Kornbluth sums it all up, gives an account of naturalism where he thinks it can do all the traditional stuff as well, namely handle justification of knowledge, beat the skeptic, and he thinks that he can lay out a general guideline to how we can expand the set of true beliefs and minimizing the false ones. And then David Lewis, last person. Lewis is actually best known for his work on possible worlds. He wrote a book called On the Plurality of Worlds, influenced by science fiction, which is, his view is that there really are possible worlds, all the alternative realities, and what they do is they make our claims about possibility true. So if you say that it's possible that Hillary won the election, Lewis would say there's some other world or worlds where Hillary, or the Hillary of that world, is president. And so he believed what's called modal realism, that really are alternative worlds. And he wrote a book about it. He also he had a huge collection of model trains. He was a big train enthusiast. I wrote his obituary for him, that's why I know. So that's why I also know he's dead, because I wrote his obituary. Not the only one, but looked like Santa Claus. So he provided a defense of externalist contextualism and deals with the problem of applying our normal standards to common sense knowledge claims. Because our standards, sort of ironically, seem to end up showing that things that are clear knowledge end up, showing they seem not to be. So he tries to fix that problem. And then later he died, he's still dead today. So that brings us to the end of part 3. Before
since we still have time left, before I do the part 4, anything about 3 that needs more 3 stuff, or any other stuff, or anything about the paper, or anything.
For the paper, I wasn't here at the beginning of the time. The paper, the draft is online tonight at 11:59, or is it like right here?
Oh, for the draft, so I can get it back to people, I need to get it during my office hours with enough time to comment on it and put it in the pickup envelope. Anything else? Okay, on to part 4. Okay, now we turn to induction, ethics, and other minds. A nice calming shaded blue. Now, I've alluded to the problem of minds in the past. And the problem, of course, is this. In our own case, we believe that we know that we are, we got a mind, and we think, we feel, etc. When it comes to other people, the question then is, abstract, the most abstract version, how do we know that other people have minds, that they think and feel as we do? Now, as a more concrete thing, laying aside like the big abstract metaphysical problem, there becomes a very concrete problem. Namely, how do you know what a person is actually thinking and feeling? So if someone says, I love you forever, how do you know that's the truth and not just a terrible, terrible lie? Or if someone says, they're happy about something, how do you know it's true? How do you know they're not just being consumed with terrible depression? There are those concrete problems. How do you ever know what's going on behind someone else's eyes? Now, we also have this application of the problem to, when we look at our good dead friend Descartes, the problem with non-humans, namely animals. Because we look at things like cats and dogs and horses and stuff, and we may wonder, do they think and feel like we do? And so the challenge is, we generally think, unless we're sociopaths, we generally think other people have minds, thoughts, and feelings, and most of us also think that animals, to varying degrees, have thoughts and feelings. But the challenge is justifying this. How do we know that other people, animals, etc., have thoughts and feelings? Or in the concrete sense, how do you know when someone says something, they believe something, or think something, how do you know that's actually true that they believe it? How do you know that they say they feel something, they actually feel it? And which is quite a challenge. Now, the traditional approach to solving this is an argument by analogy. So the idea basically is what we reason is we say, well, and this is something presented by our good friend Descartes, our good friend Mill. We say, well, I think and feel, other people like me, they think and feel it too, problem solved. But is the problem solved? Well, one philosopher who looked at this in quite a bit of detail is our good dead friend, John Stuart Mill. And it's in his examination of Sir William Hamilton's philosophy, 1865. Not Hamilton of American fame or Broadway fame, but another Hamilton. Maybe related, maybe not. So, how can we argue by analogy to other people thinking and feeling? And again, it's something in a way that we kind of, anybody who's not a sociopath, believes. But the problem is, how do we justify that? We all, unless we're sociopaths, believe it, but how do we know? Now, as Mill goes through, the evidence we use is this. We use antecedent and subsequent bodily states. In other words, we have some sort of, one thing occurs, another thing occurs. So, for example, someone steps on a nail and they say, ow. Or you get someone a present and they say, oh, thank you, and they smile and they're all happy. Now, as Mill reasons, and it's how we all kind of reason if we were pressed to give an account, we reason other people have feelings because they have bodies,
which from our own cases, we know to be antecedent conditions of feelings. They show signs, which in our own cases, we know that we do those things because we have feelings. So if someone's, smiling, we infer that they are feeling happy. Or if they're crying, we infer they're feeling sad. And so we're conscious in our own case of these facts. Namely, we get, something happens, and again, like you step on a nail, then you get the feeling of pain, and then you express that by going, ow, and jumping around or something. And so this is something we all do. So what about in the case of other people or other entities? Well, what we get is, this is where the problem comes in. In our own case, we get like the whole picture. So from our perspective, you step on a nail, then we feel pain, and then we say, wow. So we're aware of all three parts. We get the stimulus, we have the feeling, and the expression. So we know in our own case that that feeling's there. But if someone else doesn't, we don't get access to the second step. We don't see what's in their mind. So what we reason is basically like this. I say, well, in my own case, this is going on. I step on something, feel pain, say ow. I see someone else step on something, they say ow. So I infer that what's going on here is like what's going on in my own mind. That they're like me. And as you know, it's going back to Descartes, I have basically two options. One is they're like me, and Mill says alive, or they're automatons, as I say, in which they're just kind of like machines, robots or organic machines, so they're not really feeling stuff. So, but I believe other people are people like me, that they're not mere automatons, and so I believe that what is true of me is true of them. That they also feel pain. So, in a very complicated manner, making a very basic argument, we get these three causal states again. Initial modification, like stepping on a nail. Feeling, pain. Third, the subsequent bodily change, fake expression, yelling, etc. And when I see the other people step on nails, I note the first two, but I never see their pain. Unlike Bill Clinton, I cannot feel their pain. I can only see the expressions. So it's a matter of inference. So since I can't prove that other people feel, all I can conclude is an inductive, by inductive analogy, I can only conclude they probably have feelings, because.
Can you not change it?
I'm sorry?
I was saying, can you not change it?
Oh, sure. So essentially the reasoning begins by analogy. We say, they're like me, when I step on nails, I feel pain, I say, oh, I'm in pain. And so I infer that because of the first two being true about them, then the first and the third being true, the second is true as well. Okay, so. Now the problem, of course, is this. I can't confirm the conclusion because I can introspect in my own case, yep, pain, but I can't retrospect into other people's minds. Again, as I said, I can't, unlike Bill Clinton, I cannot feel their pain. So at best we get probability. Other people probably think and feel, but we feel, unless we're sociopaths, we feel certain. Until we get exposed to philosophy, we don't have doubts, again, unless we're sociopaths.
Now, then it comes to the question of how good is the argument by analogy? Well, in this case, pretty terrible. How so? Well, what we're doing is in the case of an argument, in this, looked at as an argument by analogy, I'm saying myself and other people are like in, these two ways. One is, I can see that, if someone encounters a male, that's the same, they have the same reaction as me, and so I infer that because they're like me in these two other ways, and also other ways, physically, etc., they're alike in the key way, namely, I got thoughts and feelings, they get thoughts and feelings too. But, as Mill points out, one problem with it is, of course, that we only have one example to go by. Namely, in my case, me, your case, you. Now, if we look at it as a generalization, kind of switching the mode of argument, if we're generalizing, what we're doing is this. It's also inductive reasoning. We have a whole population, in this case, all the people. And then what we do is we pull out a sample, and we say what is true of the sample we observed is true of the whole population. Now, the strength of an argument by analogy is based on how alike the two things are. So you could argue that we're really, really alike in all kinds of ways, therefore alike in this way. And you could argue that individual to individual, that could be a fairly strong analogy. But of course, the problem is, it's still an argument by analogy, everything can hold, but the conclusion can still be false. Now, if we look at it as a generalization, what each of us would be doing is this. I would say in my own case, when I step on a nail, I feel pain, so I respond, and so I'm generalizing to the whole population. And the quality of an argument, inductive argument that's a generalization, depends on sample size and also how representative it is. So the bigger the better, and the more like it is to the whole population, the better. But there are two pretty serious problems. One is the sample size is, well, in my case, me, sample of one. In terms of being representative, well, part of the problem is, again, the size, sample of one. And of course, what's the question is everyone else like me? Am I like everyone else? And that's in question. So, a terrible generalization. So, for example, to use another example of a other-minded analogy. Suppose you ask one person how they think they're going to vote in 2020. Would you be confident that that person would predict the outcome of the election? No. Now, there's a chance they'd be right, but a sample of one would be super, super small. Or if you were, running a pharmaceutical company, you wouldn't run the study of the experiment on one person and say, well, it worked for this person, it's great. So yeah, we have such a small sample of one, that our generalization would seem completely unjustified. Because in my own case, I'm going from me to everybody. So the sample is too small. I have no idea if it's representative or not, so problem. And so Mill's right. We really, really feel this is true. Other people think and feel, but of course we don't. Logically, we can't say we know. And if we look at it as a generalization, it's incredibly bad. Most likely, fallacy, a hasty generalization. So we end up in this conundrum where, as Mill points out, we end up with, yeah, unless I'm a sociopath, I totally think other people think and feel, but looked at logically, I have almost zero justification for this. My reasoning is, in any other case, we'd say this is terrible, unacceptable reasoning. So in the face of that problem, what did people do? Well, one approach which was still a big thing when I was an undergrad, long time ago in a place far, far away, was behaviorism. And it's probably still around today. I mean, if you go into psychology departments, you might find hiding in the basement a behaviorist, but never go in the basement. So what are the behaviorists? Well, there's methodological behaviorism, and there's also what's called metaphysical behaviorism. Methodological behaviorism is basically the view that you can never actually know what's in someone's mind, so you just go, as a practical matter, you go by their behavior. And in a way, we're all methodological behaviorists, because we go by how people behave, and that's how we do our judgments. Although, we do sometimes suspect people are up to something. Well, they prematurely are. So what did the philosophical behaviorists do? Well, their view was this. They essentially said, okay, you look at the problem with their minds, and there's no way to know whether people think or feel. So they accept, that the argument by analogy, the generalization, they're just, as Bill pointed out, they're just terrible as arguments. So, how do we solve the problem? Well, what they do is pretty straightforward. They basically say, okay, going back to Mill's example, you got, step on the nail. I know in my own case I feel pain. I say, I've stepped on a nail. If we see somebody else doing it, again, we don't know what's going on in there, but the behavior says, here's how I solve the problem. This doesn't matter. You don't consider that at all. So you don't say, I wonder what's going on in there. You infer that if something is engaging in this behavior, you infer that it's in pain. Because the mental state of being in pain is taken to be a physical state. So then pain, on the behaviorist view, is not the feeling, it's the behavior. Hence, the reason why they call it behaviorist is because it's the behavior. So if you're speaking to a behaviorist and you said, behaviorist, what is pain? They wouldn't say that it's this mental thing. They would say it's this behavior. So what we consider every mental state, every feeling and thought for the behaviorist would be explained, cashed out, analyzed in terms of physical behavior. So for them, sadness would not be like the dreary, gray feeling that consumes your soul. It would be tears and frowny face and saying things like, I am sad. Similarly, happiness would be not, a glowing warmth in your soul. It would be, smiling and saying, I'm happy. A thought would be not, what's going on in your mind. It would be exhibited by your behavior, like writing it out or speaking it, etc. So it's purely, behavior. So hence the name behaviorist. There's a kind of a bad joke about behaviorists. Two behaviorists run into each other in the morning. One behaviorist says to the other, you're okay, how am I? Because the idea being you have to judge people, there's no internal stuff, it's all external behavior. So the joke is, you have to have someone else tell you how you feel because you don't actually feel anything, it's all in your behavior. Which is why philosophers rarely become comedians. Except for many do, like Steve Martin. So why did behaviorism take over the world? Well, it kind of did for a while. It was super popular in psychology for a long time. When I was an undergrad, there were still behaviorists around. Again, there's probably some working in the basement of the psychology building of all the schools. Now, one of the stock problems for behaviors is kind of the obvious one, namely this. If you just make behavior to be the thing, like behaving this way is pain, behaving that way is happiness, behaving the other way is etc. There's the very obvious fact that we can fake behavior. People do it, we do it all the time. And now if behaviorism is true, so the criticism goes, there would be no fake behavior, because if you acted sad, you would be sad. If you acted happy, you would be happy. And in some cases, this can be good, because there would be no such thing, I guess, as depression, because you could just act happy and be happy. That's all there is to it. But obviously, normal people supposedly fake behavior all the time, and the only way to make sense of like acting, we don't think, for example, when actors are acting, that they need to truly feel what they're doing. Because, I mean, in some cases, they probably really get into it. They do like a really sad scene, and they're still like crying afterwards. But you might have seen like the behind the scenes things where someone's doing some like sad and tragic scene, and they break out, laughing uproariously because of some silly thing, so they're clearly not feeling sad. So the critics would say behavior is not a necessary condition for mental states, because you could be feeling sad but show no sadness, or you be in pain but show no pain. It's also not sufficient, because you could be pretending to be in pain and not being in pain, or you pretend to be happy and not be happy, or pretend to be sad and not be sad. And so the stock criticism is, behavior can't be the mental state, because we can fake that. And faking wouldn't make any sense unless there was something going on inside. Another problem, if we say about someone else, they have a pain, seems to be about pain behavior when I say about someone else. Because, for all I know, they're faking it to get sympathy. But when I say I have a pain, it's not just about like the behavior, but also about the feeling. Because when I say I have a pain, I'm talking about my feeling and not my behavior. Whereas when I talk about other people, I'm talking about their behavior, but I'm also kind of thinking that they have the feeling as well. And if I say that person doesn't have a pain, when said by someone else of me, contradicts my claim that I have a pain when said by me. So the problem here is this. Going back to like Descartes, evident truths, etc. If I say I have a pain, they're self-evidently primary, namely, right. And if someone else like denies it because they're not behaving, they seem to be wrong. Because again, commonsensically, there probably have been cases where you've been hurt but haven't been pain but haven't shown, been sad and haven't shown. Like you gotta go to work, you can't be like all sad and at work. You gotta put on that big fake American smile to sell that stuff. So that seems to be a problem. So the behaviorists then, of course, try to fix this, arguing that behavior is still necessary for our attribution of psychological phenomena. And our good dead friend Wittgenstein said, any so-called inner process needs an outward criteria. So basically they're still sticking to their behaviorism. So the critics say, I can be in pain without there being any outward sign of behavior. If someone says you're not in pain because you're not showing pain, that seems to be untrue, because everyone's been in a scenario where they've felt pain but didn't show it for some reason. Or again, emotion, like you might be really sad, but you have to work and put on that big fake American smile. Now the behaviorists again try to account for this, and people who are behaviorists said, yeah, that totally worked. And of course the critics said, not so much. So what did the dead folks say about this problem? Well, our good dead friend Bertrand Russell tries again Mill's argument by analogy, tries to support that again. Our good dead friend Price also likes the analogical argument, but he tries to use this, perhaps borrowing from our good dead friend Descartes, based not on the body, but language understanding. Namely, we infer that other people have minds because they do the talking thing. And this essentially goes back to Descartes. We talked about Descartes and the minds of animals, where Descartes claims that, as we'll see when we talk about Descartes, that Descartes claims that the test for knowing if something has a mind or not is, does it use true language? And so Bryce essentially steals that from Descartes. And he gives the example of a gorse bush, which is a type of bush, not a George, not like the Bush family. It's not like George or Jeb or George W. So imagine you're like hiking along and a bush says to you, hey, you might want to turn back, there's like a mountain lion up ahead. Now, of course, the first thing you probably think is, someone's pranking you, that there's like a speaker or something. You go and check the bush and there's like no speakers. And then when you clearly hear the voice coming out of the bush, you'd start to think, well, yeah, this bush has got, it's thinking, because it's talking. And so the general kind of rule is, if stuff talks, then we think that it thinks. And again, we'll see this when we talk about our good dead friend Descartes, and Price later stole it and used an example of the bush to illustrate this. Now, another philosopher, Norman Malcolm, not super famous, but he goes after the analogical argument and the language argument. How so? Well, going back to the bush example, he has a different set of intuitions. Whereas we may be inclined to think, okay, that bush is talking, it's thinking. Provided we're sure that it's not some sort of hoax with a speaker in there. But he claims we wouldn't believe that a bush talking in a meaningful way would prove they have minds. Now again, that's kind of his intuition, because this is not true of me. I mean, if I was talking, there's a bush and it was saying all this meaningful stuff, and no matter how I check for microphones and got out like a some scan for Wi-Fi and radio and stuff, and it kept talking sensibly, then I would think, well, this is weird, but that bush has got a mind. But he thinks that people wouldn't believe that. But again, it comes down to a battle of intuitions. I think he's wrong, because if there's a bush in my backyard and that thing talked to me all the time, and I got some engineers come out and say, hey, is there anything being broadcast to this? Are there any wires? Is there any electromagnetic signature? And they're like, nope. The bush is like, I told you so. I just say, well, as weird as it is, that bush is thinking. So there we go. But he thinks, yeah, that you would think the other way. And there are some people who would. They would say, yeah, it's a bush, so what? It's just talking. It's not really thinking. Now, he also rejects the purely behaviorist theory. So he doesn't accept pure behaviorism. But he does think that these behavioral criteria, these standards, are what lead us to have this belief in other minds. So, to use kind of a clearly true and obvious point, we learn about other people's pain by observation. We see their pain behavior. And so that's how, on this account, which seems true, you could say causally, the reason we think other people have pain is because, again, the order by analogy, that people act in these ways. And he claims these features are natural expressions of such behavior. Now, in a way, he's being kind of, I guess, speciesist, because he would say that it wouldn't make sense to suppose a tree or a gorse bush could have pain, and his thought is not uncommon, that we think it just applies to people. So the bush doesn't look like us, it doesn't act like us, so we wouldn't think that it was in pain, even if like we snipped a leaf and screamed at us. He claims it wouldn't make sense. Now again, this is a battle of intuitions. I think he's wrong, because I think if the bush was talking coherently and sensibly, then I did all that checking and so forth, I would consider maybe someone still, playing a prank on me, an incredibly elaborate, incredibly difficult to pull off prank for no apparent reason, for what payoff, who knows. But at a certain point, after I check for wires and microphones and broadcasting and stuff, hallucinations and so on, then I would think, yeah, it is thinking. And if, like something like an insect started chewing on it and started, saying, hey, get that bug off me, I would think, yeah, it is feeling pain. So this is a battle of kind of how you feel about it. Okay, Michael, then we'll finish up. Again, another philosopher, not super famous. He looks at it from going back to our reliabilist view, and he claims essentially this belief has come about and the problem is intractable. Why? Now his solution is this. One thing that became popular, and still popular now, is evolutionary accounts of stuff. And it became kind of infected philosophy, still infecting it to this day. And one reason why I use the term infection is because, not because it's always bad, but because it often gets sort of used in service of, well, bad stuff. It typically, this is no knocking its evolutionary theory itself, but it often gets misused towards racist and sexist ends. So always a bit of concern there. So what he does is he embraces this theory of evolution. And the standard theory of evolution approach is, one we saw back in the beginning, is the idea being this. Why do we believe in other minds? Well, if we didn't, then we probably die. Beings that believe in other minds tend to survive or reproduce. So why do we think there are other minds? Evolution. Because our ancestors who believed in other minds, our ancestors believed in other minds, and that enabled them to reproduce. I guess the people who didn't believe in other minds died off. So that'd be the explanation. Why can't we then fully explain it? Well, he's right about this point, namely, we don't have a complete explanation of consciousness yet. So far, we've had to, look at it in terms of knowledge of the physical world, and, he says, much like Chisholm, let us say that we do know the space-time structure of the physical world, we know physical stuff. But as far as a qualitative character, he says, let's not deny it, but we can't say we know, so let's be agnostic. But in the case of people, we feel we know more than this. We are convinced, unless we're sociopaths, that other people think and feel. So, why? Well, his why is this. We're not content to think that we know only the space-time structure of, that other people have brains and stuff, that they, have these causal chains, etc. And he does a kind of sexist example with using the wife. I guess I should put that for today. Kind of his test is kind of a clever one. If you're married, or in a relationship, try applying this to your spouse or significant other. Tell them that you don't know what they think or feel, and you're only familiar with the fact that their space-time structure of their mind and their capacity to issue causal chains, and that you don't know if they have any thoughts or feelings, you don't know if they have any love or happiness or sadness, and see how well that works. I guess in the case if the other person was also like a wacky philosopher, it may work. And essentially he claims that, in a way it's sort of analogous of Chisholm's view. We may kind of pretend we don't know, but we're not actually, unless we're crazy, we're actually not going to push that too far. So he concludes that because, like in normal life, people who are psychopaths or sociopaths, they never act like their theory. They never when they're married, it's their anniversary, they don't think, well, maybe the other person doesn't think or feel anything, blah, blah, blah. We think, according to him, much like we saw with Locke, that the skepticism of other minds is professional rather than truly sincere. Now, of course, that doesn't prove that the skepticism is an error, but it is an interesting point, namely that even philosophers who profess to say, I don't know if other people have minds, in their normal everyday life they act as if people do. Again, of course, that doesn't prove that there are, but it's kind of an interesting point. And you could adopt like a Lockean view of practicality, namely, you don't know whether people have minds for sure, but you'd be less happy if you acted like they didn't, because people wouldn't take that terribly well. So I guess we'll end a bit early because we're already in part 4, and I'll go and do the draft stuff. So I'll head to my office to get a draft. Be happy to take that to my office, draft size it, and then put it in the pick-up envelope so you can pick it up. If you don't have a draft,